Hi, my name is Britton Cotton, and this is my video on chemical weapons in World War One. So, some of the basics. Chemical weaponry has been around since the dawn of humanity. The scope of chemical weapons is fairly broad, encompassing anything from oil fires to mustard gas. I'm only going to be focusing on gas weapons. Chemical weapons and subsequently chemical warfare began in World War One. Every country that was in World War One used chemical weapons at some point. And Fritz Haber, also known as the father of chemical warfare, is the one who developed mustard gas after winning a Nobel Prize. Fritz Haber was born on December 9th, 1886 in Prussia and died on January 29th, 1932 in Switzerland. He was born to a Jewish family in what was then Prussia but is now Poland. He received an education at Heidelberg University. In total, Hatter popped around 4 universities in the span of 5 years, finally obtaining his doctorate. Among his work on glass electrodes and petroleum, Haber also focused on nitrogen fixation, which is basically taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and putting it into either a solid or a liquid form. A British chemist named William Crookes in 1898 warned that food production would not meet world crop yields and that they needed to increase crop yields with nitrogen fertilizers. Nitrogen is essential for plant growth and needs to be in a water-soluble solution to be absorbed by plants. In 1908, Haber found a way to produce ammonia synthetically, and in 1911 the first ammonia product plant built. 30 tons of ammonia could be made per day, increasing crop yields tremendously. Haber was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his work on nitrogen fixation. Now, during World War I, Haber worked with another German chemist named Wilhelm Oswald. Wilhelm quickly realized ammonia's potential, oxidizing into nitric acid, which would be used in explosives. Seeing this potential in ammonia, the German military requested other possible compounds which could be used in weaponry. Haber suggested in 1915 the use of chlorine gas as a chemical agent against the other side, the Allies, and so began the use of deadly chemical weapons in war. Now, before this, in 1914, tear gas was used by both the Central Powers and the Allied forces, but its effects were limited and it was nothing like chlorine gas at all. Germany ended up spearheading the use and creation of chemical weapons during World War I. Now the head of the German gas warfare program, Fritz Haber continued his first attempt at a deadly chemical weapon, chlorine gas, or Cl2. The First Battle of Ypres in 1915 is where chlorine gas debuted. While the Germans lost, they killed about 1,100 French and Canadian soldiers and wounded thousands more. Despite this loss, German officials were pleased with the effectiveness of Haber's product. And just a not-so-fun fact, after learning of her husband's role in the Battle of Ypres, um, Haber's wife killed herself. Immediate effects of chlorine gas poisoning are eye irritation and a burning feeling in the lungs. If breathed in, this green-colored gas would bond with water molecules in the lungs, forming hydrochloric acid, or HCl. This caused coughing, vomiting, and death at anything greater than 1,000 parts per million, or ppm. So essentially, chlorine gas drowned people from the inside out using acid. It's just awful. Phosgen was also a chemical weapon used in World War I, and it was Haber's next project after chlorine gas. Now, phosgen was a colorless gas that was first used at the Second Battle of Ypres. This gas, POCl2, was the most lethal weapon unleashed in World War I, accounting for roughly 85% of all gas-related deaths. It's hard to understand how someone could do something as self-righteous as solve an impending food shortage and just a few years later do a 180 and create devastating chemical irritants. The reason Haber did what he did is because he had the interest of his country at heart. He wanted to end the war quickly, but he actually ended up prolonging the war. Now, how does phosgen kill? Phosgen kills by being trapped in the alveoli of lungs. Now, alveoli are the small spongy parts of the inside of lungs which absorb oxygen. Phosgen gets trapped in these alveoli, creating a situation where lungs are no longer able to absorb oxygen. What's worse is this gas is odorless, even if it's several parts per million above the lethal dose. All these parameters combined, being colorless, odorless, and extremely lethal, explains the high casualty rate. Now on to mustard gas. This was invented and used in 1917 by, again, Fritz Haber. The first battle it saw was the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917. And this was the last major chemical made by Haber. Mustard gas's effects. So mustard gas had a yellow color in World War I, mainly because it was made impure, and pure mustard gas is actually clear in color. Blisters form on the body when in contact with mustard gas, filling with yellow ooze. Only 2 to 3% of mustard gas victims died, but the ones that survived weren't so lucky. Chemical burns were also a side effect, as was skin irritation. And of the people that survived, respiratory problems were common, as well as cancer later in life. Chloropicrin was also another gas weapon used in World War I. It was originally created in 1848 by John Stenhouse, a Scottish chemist. The original purpose of this was as an insecticide and an antifungal agent in agriculture. The use of chloropicrin in military combat began in 1916. In order to combat gas, both sides started using gas masks, but chloropicrin could bypass and destroy these masks. So, while it wasn't as deadly as the other chemicals, chloropicrin allowed other chemicals to get into the lungs by destroying their gas mask. Tear gas, first used in 1914, is clear as a liquid, but when evaporated it turns into a cloud-like gas. Most common forms of tear gas used in World War I were XYLYL bromide or ethyl bromoacetate. Both were described as having a fruity or pleasant smell. But don't let the smell fool you, because this gas causes eye irritation and uncontrolled tearing, which is why it was called tear gas. In large doses, it can even cause temporary blindness, but this resolved after 30 minutes, usually. Because of this, tear gas wasn't as effective as the chemical weapons that came after it. Tear gas is a special case in the history of chemical weapons. It started use in World War I, and it's still used in most countries today. And it's primarily utilized by governments and police forces to stop riots, but sadly it's often misused and directed at peaceful protesters. Effect on soldiers. Chemical weapons such as mustard gas killed soldiers indiscriminately. Wounded, surrendered, healthy, it didn't matter. Only a few shells of phosgen and chloropicrin were enough to clear out entire foxholes. The scarring left on soldiers' bodies from chemical burns worsened the already rampant disease that plagued trench warfare. Being as unpredictable as they were, these weapons were known to blow back onto the same people that released them. Soldiers weren't the only ones affected by these gases used in war. Chemical weapons would often get blown into towns neighboring major battles. An estimated 150,000 civilians were affected. While not as horrifically potent, burns, vomiting, and respiratory problems still commonly occurred. Upon its use in World War I, chemical weapons grew to be very controversial. The indiscriminate nature of chemical weapons led to many questioning the ethics of their use. They could kill anyone from soldiers to war prisoners, and pictures of burn victims are horrific, but they don't properly encapsulate the feeling of being burned. This controversy led to the international adoption of the Geneva Protocol in 1925 by the League of Nations, not to be confused with the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Protocol states that use of poisonous, burning, or asphyxiating gases is prohibited in international conflict, as well as bacterial weapons. Now, how is this ban enforced? So, any violations of the Geneva Protocol can be settled in a few different ways. The state can have an internal legal investigation and prosecution. The case could go to an international court if deemed necessary, or it can be resolved through diplomatic channels and even economic sanctions. In closing, I'd also like to mention that atomic weapons, like nuclear bombs, are technically considered chemical weapons because they leave radioactive fallout that can cause cancer for generations. So, technically, they're banned under international chemical weapons laws. And here's my bibliography. Bye.